I want to share a few thoughts on the topic and on the book that Alon has put together, the volume "Idolatry: A Contemporary Jewish Conversation." And I have to say that I found this to be a tremendously stimulating book, and found a great deal in it to which I'd like to respond. My task today is to come to this question from the perspective of the tradition in which I practice, which is a Hindu tradition. I'm in the tradition of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, the tradition of the Vedanta societies in the US and rest of the world, and in India, it's called the Ramakrishna Mission. And if we first just look at the concept of idolatry itself, the very term is a bit of a fighting word if you come from a Hindu tradition. First of all, there really is no corresponding concept to idolatry as far as I can tell. Now, there may be Sanskrit sources that I've not consulted, but I did a bit of digging in preparation for this presentation, and I just couldn't find anything that really corresponded. And some of the older dictionaries that do use the term idolatry, they're using it for things like murti puja, which is not idolatry at all in the theological sense. It is simply the use of images in worship, which is not only not a bad thing in Hindu traditions, it's something that's celebrated. It's something that is very much part of the tradition. So initial reaction to the concept of idolatry, I would say, from the perspective of most Hindus, would be a negative reaction. These traditions freely employ images of divine beings. The practice of murti puja is a murti or a pratima, as it's also called, as an image of a deity. And it is, of course, very well understood in the tradition that these images are objects. They're made of stone or wood or paper mache or marble, all kinds of items. All kinds of materials are used to create these images. And there is a ritual process, a prana pratishta, it's called, the breathing of life into the image. The image, in effect, becomes the deity, who then is treated as an honored guest. And puja, worship, is modeled on the practice of inviting an honored guest into one's home. You feed the guest, you sing to the guest, you entertain the guest, and that is what puja involves. So if we're just very blunt about it, much of what makes up Hindu ritual practice and worship is precisely what he sees described as being forbidden in some of the texts of the Abrahamic traditions. The idolatry in its original context refers to these kinds of practices, which have been widespread in indigenous traditions throughout the world. The Egyptians used images, the Romans used images, the Greeks used images, and so on. Interestingly, though, if we look at Vedic thought and practice, if we look at the core of the Hindu tradition, there is, in fact, a convergence of some of the same core ideas one finds in the Abrahamic traditions, along with the practices that we see of the use of images in indigenous traditions across the globe. So if you've grown up with the sort of monotheistic lens, you could say, of looking at religion, there seems to be a vast gulf between what is called monotheism, seen as prohibiting idolatry, and then polytheism, which is seen as celebrating idolatry. When we really dig into what the Hindu traditions teach, it's much more complex than that binary would suggest. I want to say more about that in a little bit. But on the surface, at least, as a religious, ritual practice, what is often called idolatry is so central to most Hindu traditions that the concept of idolatry is something to be avoided, something that, again, most Hindus would have a strong aversion to. This is a concept that's been used to demean Hindu traditions. Oh, they're idol worshippers, right? The justification of the destruction of places of worship, and so on. Despite this, though, and this is what I think is really brilliant about Alon's book, idolatry can nevertheless be a very useful concept in Hindu traditions if we understand it differently, right? And this is what the book does, right? It pushes beyond the traditional identification of idolatry with a set of ritual practices, and it digs more deeply into this concept. Is there something else going on with idolatry? And there most definitely is. I think coming from a Hindu perspective, we can see this as an example of Frank Clooney's deep learning across religious borders, right? If we engage in deep listening, if we don't simply react to the term idolatry, and if we're attentive to what the Jewish tradition understands idolatry to mean in its deepest sense, then it resonates quite well, not at the level of ritual and worship, but at a more conceptual level. And that's what I want to get into now, that we can think in Hindu terms of conceptual idolatry. And I'm using the word conceptual here in a very vague sense, but I actually have something quite specific in mind that I want to develop and explain. So, as I was saying earlier, Vedic thought involves, in some sense, a convergence of some of the same ideals we find in monotheistic traditions, along with, and in fact, undergirding practices that have traditionally been seen as associated with polytheism, idolatry, etc. So there is, as the Upanishads say, one ultimate reality described as Eka Eva Advitiya, one alone without a second. This is a refrain we see in description of Brahman, the infinite. Yet there are many deities. And this seeming paradox is addressed very early in the tradition with the very famous Rigvedic expression, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Varanti, the real is one, but the wise speak of it in many ways. And we hear this expression quoted all the time out of context. If we put it in its original context, various Vedic deities are being listed. And so the question is being addressed, well, which one is the one? Well, they all kind of are. They are all expressions of, they're all names for one reality that is ultimately beyond expression, beyond description through any one concept. So in a certain sense, the diversity of deities and the practice of the use of images in Hinduism, though it appears contrary to what is given in, for example, the biblical text, it is in fact based on the same core insight, right? That if we start with the insight that the ultimate reality is beyond anything we can conceive, we can go two different directions with that. We could say, okay, then let's not try to conceive of it at all. Let's not try to give it an image or a form. And that's the direction that the monotheistic traditions have gone. The other direction, the direction the Hindu traditions have gone, is to say, okay, no single image or no single concept can encompass it. So we can have as many concepts as we like, as long as we're mindful that they are pointing beyond themselves to something deeper, something higher. And this, I think, that as long as clause is the key point here, where I think the concept of idolatry can be very helpful from a Hindu perspective. So if we go to the root texts, if we look at the in the Jewish tradition, right? Look in the Torah, right? There is the prohibition, you shall have no other gods before me. And coming from a Hindu perspective, if what we mean by God is that infinite reality which is all-encompassing and beyond which there is nothing, the very notion of an other God is contradictory, right? It seems like, well, there could be no other gods, right? There could be only one. And of course, this brings us to the question, what do we mean by God? Because the word God has been used in the last couple of centuries to translate a couple of different Hindu terms that actually don't mean exactly the same thing. So some differentiation is needed here. In the Vedanta tradition, the term God is often used to talk about Brahman. Brahman, the ground of all being, the infinite, that which is ultimately beyond all conceptualization. This same infinite is said to also be identical with our own true self, the self of each and every being, right? The Atman. The distinctions also introduced in Vedantic discourse between Nirguna Brahman, Brahman beyond all limiting qualities, and ultimately beyond what can be literally known, and Saguna Brahman, Brahman with qualities, which is described as the supreme being, right? So we see terms like Ishvara or Bhagavan, and it is Saguna Brahman that comes a little closer to what the word God often means in monotheistic discourse: a supreme being, a being above all, a being upon whom all are dependent, but who is dependent upon none. So these are a couple of different meanings of God we see in the Hindu tradition. There's the supreme being, Ishvara, Bhagavan, and then there is being itself, you could say, Nirguna Brahman, Brahman beyond all categories. So the ultimate goal in Hindu traditions, there are many penultimate goals, a good life in this world and, a good rebirth and so on. But the ultimate goal is liberation from the rebirth cycle. And the varied Hindu traditions differ precisely over how exactly one goes about that. And so there are theistic traditions that are oriented toward the supreme being, traditions that emphasize bhakti or devotion. And from a bhakti perspective, one could say, very much as one could say in the Jewish tradition, that you don't want anything to come between you and God, right? That what is most important in life, the saving experience, is the experience of absolute devotion, absolute surrender to the divine one. Now, again, we see this expressed differently in terms of ritual. Images can be made and are made and are encouraged to be made in these traditions and used ritually. But again, we're not talking about idolatry at that level. We're talking about conceptually what comes between us and the supreme being. We often will proclaim theologically, we'll say that God is the most important thing in life, God is the most important thing in one's existence, and yet our behavior so often shows exactly the opposite. And Ramakrishna often would make the following comparison. He would talk about how a kitten cries out for its mother. And when the kitten cries out for the mother, the kitten is thinking of nothing else but the mother. I just want my mother. I just want my mother. And the kitten cries and cries. And Ramakrishna says this is how we need to cry out for God, right? It is only when God is uppermost in our mind that we will truly experience bhakti, that we'll truly experience realization. And there's another story Ramakrishna tells about a man who is asking his master, how do I find God? How do I have this realization? How do I come close to God? And the master, they happen to be walking. They're wading in the river. The master plunges the disciple's head under the water for a period of time, and lets him up finally. And the master says to the disciple, "What were you thinking while your head was underwater?" And he said, "I was thinking, air, give me air." And he says, "When you think of God with that same intensity that you were calling out for air, then you'll have realization." Right? So how often, Ramakrishna says rhetorically, do we cry out for God like the kitten crying for her mother, or like the disciple crying out for air? So often we don't, right? In fact, so often our priorities are elsewhere. Any of these other priorities could be idols, right? We can, if we want to employ this concept of idol, again, we're not talking about the ritualistic practice of any tradition. We're talking about the attitude toward which we approach anything in life, right? Anything in life. There is a wonderful story in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The sage Yajnavalkya is about to go off on his journey. He's going to undertake sannyasa or renunciation, and he's ensuring he has two wives. He's ensuring that both of them are well taken care of materially, and he's fulfilling his responsibility, and then he can then leave. And he's ensured that they're both cared for materially, and so he's about to leave. And one of his wives, Katyayani, asks, I have one more thing that I need from you. He says, I've left behind all of my material belongings for you. She says, yes, that gives me material belongings, but it doesn't give me the wisdom that you are seeking. I want to share of that wisdom as well. And he tells her the following. He gives her a litany of basically the good things in life. And he starts with himself because she's upset that he's going to be leaving. And he says, the husband is dear, not for his own sake, but because of the Atman, right? Because of that self within, The idea that the husband is a manifestation of that highest reality. And he says the wife is dear not for her own sake, but because of the Atman within. Children are dear not for their own sake, but because of the Atman within. And he goes on and he lists a whole range of things, different kinds of people and objects and animals, everything in the world. And all of it, he said, is dear not for its own sake, but because of Atman within. I think that he is essentially talking about how to avoid idolatry in this deeper sense of the word, right? That all of these things that are dear to us, we can make them into the object of our ultimate longing and our ultimate concern. And in so doing, we fall short of, we fail to attach to that which truly is ultimate. We do not see the things of this world as, in a sense, windows through which we could perceive the divine. That is how an image is used in Murti Puja, for example. It's a window through which one can see the divine reality. It is not the divine reality, but is a medium for that. And so anything that becomes an obstacle between ourselves and ultimate reality, we could say, is an idol. The same thing that can be an idol at one moment or for one person can be that window into divinity for the other. Do I have just 1 minute?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I am wrapping up. So this is perfect timing. So I'm struck by the fact that this same insight is expressed repeatedly throughout the book. And the one that really leaped out at me was in Norman Solomon's article in his chapter, where he has a section on Torah as idol. You know, the Torah is the word of God, right? It's the most sacred thing. Yet it itself can become an obstacle. It can become a thing. The phenomenon that we call fundamentalism around the world, taking a sacred text as an idol. Swami Vivekananda, in my tradition, warns against worshiping the messenger at the expense of the message. Right? Anything can be an idol. The question is, do we utilize it skillfully as a medium to perceive the divine, or do we take it as something separate and let it become an obstacle? And I have this one, 3 sentences I want to give at the end. This is sort of what my thought process has been leading toward. The concept of idolatry is especially helpful, I think, to all of us in a world that is choking on its own materialism, where the environment is degraded in the name of the idol of consumerism. It's a vital concept in a world afflicted by sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism in the name of the idols of religion, race, state, and nationalism. When we make anything an obstacle between ourselves and what is truly of value, we participate in our own self-destruction.